Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much, Han, and thank you, Jen. I'm really grateful to you both for convening this extraordinary colloquium. Really enjoyed the first session, very excited about tonight and about the sessions to come. And I'm delighted this evening to introduce two extraordinary translators, translator activists, poets. And I'll just say a quick word about each. The first is Jen Eliana Hoffer representing Antena Aire, which was a language justice and language experimentation collaborative founded in 2010 with JD Pluker, who unfortunately can't be here tonight because they're in Houston and lost power, as many of us are struggling with the storm this evening, unfortunately. Both JD and Jen are writers, artists, literary translators, bookmakers, and social justice interpreters. For 10 years, Antena Aire activated links between social justice work and artistic practice by exploring how critical views on language can help us to reimagine and rearticulate the worlds we inhabit. They're currently preparing a book project that archives work done over that decade of collaboration, which is titled Between Language and Justice, and that will be published by The Operating System, as well as a translation project titled The Travesty Museum of Peru by Giuseppe Campuzano. So welcome, Jen. Danmi Che was born in Seoul, South Korea, and is the author of DMZ Colony, which was published last year by Wave Books. Hardly War, also published by Wave Books. The Morning News is Exciting, published by Action Books, and several chapbooks and pamphlets of poems and essays. She's a recipient of a National Book Award for Poetry, Whiting Award, the Lannan Literary Fellowship, the Lucian Strick Translation Prize, and a DAD Artists in Berlin Fellowship. Danmi has translated several collections of Kim Hai-soon's poetry, including Autobiography of Death, which received the 2019 International Poetry Prize from Griffin 2 years ago. So without more ado than that, I want to welcome both Danmi and Jen this evening and turn it over. I think, Jen, you're going to get us started. Thank you. Warm round of applause to welcome you.
Oh, thanks. We can do a warm round. We can do a warm round of reaction buttons. Thank you to the aforementioned everyone. Thank you, Jen number one. Thank you, Danmi, for making work that keeps me alive. Thank you to the humans whose fault it is that I am alive. My parents have come to every event I've ever done in the Bay Area, and now that we're doing events on Zoom, they can come to the ones that aren't in the Bay Area. So I'm really moved that you're here. Thank you, and I love you both. I also really love JD Pluker, and I'm really sad that they can't be here. This was going to be our first, it's actually sort of perfect. It's our first public event since Antena Aire's transformation. And I'm doing it alone, which is maybe exactly what needs to be happening. I'm going to start, I'm doing what JD and I plan to do together. Let's all take a moment first, however, and beam some warmth to all of Texas, but specifically to JD and their family in Houston. So let's just give 10 seconds of our warmth and attention and energy to JD. And even when we, I'm just turning my clock on, even when we may believe we are doing things alone, we are not. All language is always collaboration and is always in conversation with history and with our future ancestors. So I know that JD and many others are here with us. I'm going to start by improvising with Rachel's support from a piece that Antena Aire is doing, left undone, always undone, called Responder por favor, which means please respond. It started in Bogota, Colombia, with some risographed sheets of paper that look like this. I'm not screen sharing, but it's okay if you can't read this, with a series of questions on them. And we have done this project in many iterations. It's a participatory research project that maybe eventually we'll make something out of some of this language, and maybe we won't. So this language comes from people in Bogota, in Mexico, in various locations in Southern California, in Washington State, in New York City, and many other places. So Rachel, I'm going to invite you to ask me a couple of those questions, and I have many pieces of paper around me that other people have written on, and some digital versions as well. So I'm reading words that belong to everyone and no one.
Does the language you use belong to you, or do you belong to it?
I don't like the idea of owning a mode of communication. It is less a possession and more of a skill in my world. Some of my words are borrowed, some my own. I do not possess them. We live together in an imperfect union.
¿Dónde vive el lenguaje en tu cuerpo?
My hands, stomach, throat. My mind, I would like it to go away. Guardo mi lenguaje en mi lengua.
¿El idioma que usas te pertenece o tú le perteneces?
I belong to language. Language determines what I see, think, feel, and do. I almost wrote my language. I don't think language can belong to anyone except in a false, illusory sense. I belong to English, a colonizer's language.
Imagine the ground you stand on as a body. Is that body made of words? Which ones?
Desierto, dinero, mutualism, violencia, agua, skin, mountain. It's hella black, hella brown, indigenous bodies. Body of water, body of land, a living body.
Which languages do you use daily? Which languages do you see or hear daily? If you'd say you only use, see, or hear English, ask yourself how many Englishes exist in your daily life.
I use Korean daily as a Korean living in Korea, but I also use English daily. I work in the English language. I love my partner's English, and I try to calibrate mine to his. Accented English and my mom's English and broken English and breaking English, and I teach English and I write against English. I hear, think, use English, Spanish, English, vernacular, English, Spanish. And I'll pause there with lots of thanks to Rachel. So I'm gonna, let's see. I'm gonna start by reading thank you to David Book, who is in the audience, whose amazing Tripwire series invited JD and me, invited Antena Aire, along with Steve Dickinson, to the San Francisco Poetry Center 10,000 eons ago, pre-pandemic. Everything is in some other universe, where we did an illuminated, illustrated performance talk, including an improvised interpreted poem. And out of that came this little booklet called The Flame Through the Bridge, Notes and Transcripts from Improvised Interpreted Poem Performances. Thank you very much for the link in the chat, Book. So I encourage you to read Tripwire, the journal. I encourage you to buy the others in the pamphlet series. They're really wonderful And I'm really grateful for all of the energies of small press labors of love that make the poetry world so much more bearable and also joyful. So I'm going to read a little bit from this pamphlet. We've been asking ourselves and others for years, what would it look like, sound like, feel like, taste like? Which histories would be uncovered, licked into visibility if we were to listen with our tongues? What we devised through trial and error and practice and experimentation was an improvised, discomfortable, text-generating experiment based on a repeating, spiraling practice of collaborative interpretation and addition, for which we invented a few key constraints to guide us. We work back and forth across Spanish and English, the two colonizer languages we each use in our daily lives. We make poems in the space between the two, and through practices we use in our everyday cross-language work. We begin with one text fragment in one language. This text fragment is immediately interpreted into the other language by the listener using consecutive interpretation. The interpreter improviser then adds one text fragment in that same language. After the reading and initial interpretation of each of our found texts, every time one of us interprets, we add a line or two of our own invention for a total, more or less, 5 sets of improvised interpretations. Our rules are that we have to take new notes on a new sheet of paper or cover our old notes every time we interpret to avoid simply transferring notes and or memorizing text blocks, and that we can return to the same original text if we want to include more of those lines. While this experiment is grounded in the technique of consecutive interpretation, where a speaker pauses every so often to allow an interpreter to deliver their message in another language, it differs significantly from actual interpreting, and in fact violates many of the central guidelines of the practice. In our working lives as interpreters, we would never perform live interpretations of poetry or other literary texts. It's just impossible. Rather, if a speaker is going to read a poem as part of their presentation, we prefer that they provide a translation of that material to us in advance. Additionally, in almost all instances of interpretation, we'd be aware of the context of the speaker's comments, which would usually follow a basic logic and create a fairly legible, linear-ish narrative. Context and logic are turned upside down when we oblige ourselves to interpret improvised lines that have only a poetic relation, often neither logical nor linear, to the preceding lines. Finally, in our practice as interpreters, we would never, ever embellish or improvise based on what we are interpreting. Quite the contrary, we would do our very best to fulfill the part of the interpreter's role that centers on accuracy and competency, and would endeavor to transmit the message as directly as possible, adhering as closely to what we heard as possible, with no omissions and no additions, and certainly no poetic improvisations. We break key rules of interpreting. We invent new constraints for the experiment. The process is eminently discomfortable, and the result, a discomfortable text, an interpretation-inspired instigation, an ultra translation, a poem, not a poem. In order to be able to capture, after Judith Butler and Carla Faesler. In order to be able to capture, it is necessary to interrupt before going in a question. Individuals are not asked to protect themselves, nor are they told what they are protecting themselves from, nor why they are protecting themselves from unforgettable monuments, to stand firm in a world without bridges, a world that falls. Everyone is atomic. Everyone falls. Everyone atomic. The prisoner could be denominated outside that denomination with no established criteria. The prisoner stained with the ink of opacity and brightness is arrested. What we have come to realize in doing these experiments and now in translating them to these pages is that the final poem is neither final nor the most important thing, nor the ultimate iteration of the experiment. The poem is the being in that moment, Two bodies moving language back and forth, speaking and re-speaking it with our hands and our mouths, sloughing off and gathering as we go. And it is also a chance for us to bring other writers into the room and into our embodied practice of writing that is not writing, activating the kinship networks of poetry and writing that enable us to continue to do this work. Where exactly does the poetry reside? In the performance or on the page where we find the transcribed poem, or in the non-empty negative space that takes shape between the writers we quote, our own interpretations and improvisations, and the audiences who witness our discomfortableness? Do we even produce a poem in the end through this process? Do we care if we don't? Or is the poem actually a kind of hovering or transit, residing in the doing, a process retained sometimes in the video produced of the performance, and sometimes here transcribed on the page, and sometimes in undefinable other space or nowhere at all? Part of the experiment, though, is also to parse through the possibility of creating a poem through this process, a process of alternative production of poetry, anti-production. What if poem is verb or air, the substance we collectively breathe, which we move through and which moves through us? What if a poem undoes itself immediately upon arrival or never arrives? We could go back and forth in our interpreted, improvised, imaginative error making endlessly. And perhaps that is part of what Antena Aire is, using our politically activated, community-rooted, cross-language practice as generative ground, bringing our poetry brains and experimental bodies to bear on our everyday practices of language transfer, doing a thing that doesn't make sense to attempt to make a different kind of sense, a different kind of making, improvising in a way that's exploratory and responsive and vulnerable, consenting, as Dr. Adrienne Keene phrases it, to learn in public. Being in the places between we don't. After Don Miche and Gabriela Torres Olivares. Being in the places between we don't understand. We don't understand claims, the jumps, rejumps, salts. No one talked to us. She loved herself anyways. Weddings happen in the past. She thinks she doesn't belong. She doesn't correspond. It isn't corresponded to her doubt. Whatever we want, we didn't want. The ocean is not the sea, the soil, the air, maybe a system without translation. A system is not a wedding. No one with a lover. Loyalty doesn't cross blood, hands, more, distances, triumph, air fixes, or something in bed, or get up, wake up out of bed, or pain in shouts, shouting, undesired pain, non-binary language, this multipolarity. Ha. Okay, gonna try a little experiment now. I'm gonna try reading a brand new piece. Let's see, I'm gonna try framing this for a moment. And then I'm also gonna try screen sharing for a second. Pause. Okay, so Antena Aire, you invoke yourself as air and then you turn into the air, which is like historical language and future ancestral language everywhere and nowhere. So Antena Aire is no longer officially making work together. And the first thing we did after we made that decision was collaboratively write a piece in response to the invitation to be here today. So I'm gonna present that piece to you. It is totally brand new and like everything, open to all kinds of doubt and questioning. I want to try to play a video for you while I read to you. And let me see if I can do this in a way. Oh shoot, I don't know if I'm able to do it because I'm not sure I'm gonna be able to see both things at once. Let me see. I'm going to try this. And if it doesn't work immediately, I'm not going to spend my entire life dealing with tech because that's no fun for anyone, especially me. Okay. I see you, Cecily, and I'm actually on purpose not going to do that because I don't want to share sound from the video, but I appreciate that your note for that. Okay, so what I want to know is if you can see a video of, I don't know how to make this full screen. I would like to know if you can see a video of the ocean. Yeah, okay. Now tell me if you can you still see the video of the ocean?
Yes.
Oh, amazing. Okay, that's really great. All right, thank you in advance. Oh, shoot, that's not what I wanted to do though. What I want is definitely not to do that. Okay. Let me see. Oh, it's because I made it be a slideshow. Does anybody know how to make a slideshow be paused in Google Slides in a way that's like 2 seconds to tell me how to do that? If not, I'm going to screen share without the slide presentation and you'll see the edges of my rest of my world here. Okay, let me try this again without letting you see any secret elements of my life that I didn't mean for you to see. Okay, so are you seeing the ocean?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Thanks for bearing with me. Here we are close to being so far from where we began and still never not arriving. We transit, we hover, we alight, we are light. Particles collide, collisions abound. A light through framed glass reads as motion. A window doesn't only provide a view, and it might also provide a view. History comes back around as a future about to occur, or a memory that might flutter, might oscillate, might vanish. The weather isn't optional. Borders demarcate territories, fields. Boundaries are useful. Borders are violent. Maybe that's not right. Maybe it's not about being right. What is right action? Language is a border, a membrane between intuition and feeling life and the external world communication gestures toward. The border is a powerful tool, literally, in the most concrete, barb-wired, surveilled, policed, restricted, search-lit, movement-controlled, weaponized way. And figuratively, in the most buoyant, apertured, expansive, broken open, limitless way. Language is utterly necessary and utterly failed. What is right action? Yes, and we are never not thinking about all the violence happening at the US-Mexico border. We are never not feeling like more abstracted or poetic references to borders need to be contextualized within the lived and too often died experiences of people at the literal borders of territories that were boundless porosities and organic matter until they were not, though they still are. Yes, and we are never not experiencing that tension torquing between our words and our wordlessness, oceanic grief unboundaried. What is right action? There is, let's say, a thing as it is being done and existing, even as it begins to close. A close is a new opening. There is always a path. A thing can be winding down and still exist. There is wind. there is air. There is also another thing, this thing that is also a being, that is also a way of being that does not exist yet, the thing that is to come. There is a relationship between opening and closing, of course, and let's say there is a border between these two things. Being inside that border is a precarious state. The border between one thing as it existed and another as it comes into existence. Or maybe these are not things at all, but a web of relations and ways of relating between bodies. In other words, writing. In other words, translating, which is in fact and in feeling other words. Membrane, ravine, suture, crease, bifurcation, proliferation, administration. It's all source. Resource, as in source again. Not to be used, but to be destined, as in directed toward. To be shared. Mutual aid. And when the aid we need, the aid we can offer shifts, how do we break open our mutuality so it can remain supple and welcoming, can continue to honor those sources? Patterning creates ritual and conjures magic and weaves warmth that can protect us from the elements, open us to the elemental. And patterning can become automatic or presumed, resisting suppleness where the weave was intended to remain open. So we needed to open it again, explicitly, carefully, with care, toward what we do not know, toward what we do not know. There are many words for the border region, some more kind than others. The border can be a breakage, a transformation. The border can be space where two things come into conflict. It can be a space of trauma, drama. It can be a space of porousness and possibility. It can, from minute to minute, change and present a disturbing variety of emotions and realities, contradictory ones. What is it to care for another in this newly boundaried space? How might we care for one another as everything around us is shattering? What is it to shatter in the space of the shattering end times? The end times recur, recur, recur over and over again. One person dying, one person beginning to breathe again, one person not beginning to breathe again. How does it change our sense of source and destination if we set out to think in this border region? There is something that is the place this all began. There are hills and there are capitals and there are buildings and there are abandoned lots. There is a specific hill in a specific landscape where the name Antenna was conjured to reference a set of shared practices we wanted to cultivate. There is one language and its various languages as they are spoken in one place, another language and its various languages being spoken in another place. There is the space between those languages where they combine and become one another or fall into one another, as if to lean one grammar into another, one vocabulary into another, as if to translate te late, do you want to latir, to beat, as a heart, where the membrane is as essential as the muscle, where the boundary or border is needed to allow for circulation. We created our own language using received and invented vocabularies. Let's say we translated. Let's say we ultra translated, and we moved around inside that language for 10 years. And now that language is no longer itself. The translation transforms the original, becomes source, reverberates against the original to shatter it. Dimensional refraction. Now that we have arrived at this point a decade later, can we say that we have arrived? Was this the destination? Who's to say, since we explicitly named that we did not know where we were going? This ending or this closing, this point of refraction, this is not an ending or a closing, or is it? What is right action? Where are we in relation to the border spaces that inhabit us? What does it look like to leave? without leaving our companions behind. This is the year we spent inside ourselves, inside this pandemic state, inside the boxes, so far, so close, breathing publicly only our air inside our masks, breathing in public, remade and restructured, a dream life that emerges without masks, like before, like we were before it began or we ended. The challenge is not exactly to make this space a generative space, much less a productive space. Biz as usual production should have stopped a long time ago, or it should have paused, but it did not. The state could have provided ways for everyone to cease production or to transform that production where it was absolutely essential. Instead, the production of a normal life continued on. So we have the source of all this, or sources, or thisnesses, and we have we where we are now, which is hardly the destination that we set out to find. In fact, the source was already a destination, the destination another source. There is no linear path between one thing and another, between one action and another, one person and another, and many others, as if you left and then you arrived. Or the linear path is there only because there was a cut or a word made at the beginning and at the end. Yes, and it is paths, a cut or a word or a phrase. And that, let's say, is something we can translate. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jen. That was fantastic. So much to talk about. I can see people responding already in the chat. And I do want to encourage folks to submit questions through the chat or to save them for our Q&A session at the end. And now I am thrilled to turn it over to Dawn-Mi Che. Dawn-Mi.
Thank you. Thank you, Jen Scapatoni, for inviting me. And thank you for your beautiful introduction about the image behind you. I've been captivated by the image the past few days. Anyway, thank you, Jen Hoffer. It's great. That was amazing. And thank you, Rachel. Okay, I'm just to save time, I'm just going to quickly read some things that sort of led to my thoughts about translation. I'm going to share a screen. I had a dental procedure yesterday, so I may not sound too clear. So that's why I wanted to share everything that I'm going to be reading. So in 2000, I became involved in the International Women's Network Against Militarism, and that's the website. You can check it out. And my role in the network was interpretation. So my translation work of translating contemporary Korean feminist poets into English began with my interpretation work as well. And it took us about 7 years to compile terms and words that we frequently used. And then we made a dictionary of Korean to English, also Spanish to English, and also Tagalog to English. So I will just read just 2 short paragraphs from it. Okay, this is our manifesto. Interpretation is a political act. At the network's 3rd International Working Meeting in Okinawa in 2000, Yoko Fukumura and Kozue Akibayashi first articulated what has become a core part of our approach, that interpretation is a political act. the network convened an International Women's Summit to redefine security in June of 2000, a few days before the annual meeting of G8 leaders in Okinawa. Our summit was convened to challenge the principle of national security on which the economic policies of the G8 are based. We knew that interpretation, which enables us to communicate across linguistic boundaries, was crucially important. But it took experience for us to fully realize the role of interpretation as an integral part of our transnational solidarity work. We were able to arrive at this perspective because of the knowledge women in the network had been accumulating and creating since the first meeting in 1997, that not only our lives and struggles are interconnected, but that our languages are also interconnected by histories of imperialism, colonialism, and militarism, and increasing economic interdependence. For us, interpretation does not belong in a neutral, apolitical realm. We understand that language is also not a neutral medium. It is located within particular social, political, and historical contexts. I'm sorry, I'm just gonna go back. So I'm going to read some terms from the dictionary, and I chose letters D, M, and Z. Deafness, 귀먹은, decisive victories, 결정적인 승리, declaration of war, 전쟁 선언, demilitarization, 탈군 사화, Department of Defense, 국방부, depleted, uranium, 감손 우라늄, deportation, 추방, depression, 우울증, dictator, 독재주의자, diet, 음식, disarm, 비무기, discrimination, 차별, divide and conquer, 나누고 정복, DMZ, 비무장지대, domestic consumption, 국내 소비, domestic security, 국내 안보, domestic violence, 가정폭력, drug addiction, 마약 중독, dump sites, 쓰레기 버리는 곳, duty free, 면세, machine gun, 기관총, majority stockholders, 다수 주주, malnutrition, 영양 부족, manifest destiny, 명백한 운명, marginalization, 소외된, Marines, 해병대, martial law, 계엄령, massacre, 학살, materialism, 물질주의, mercenary army, 용병부대, middle class, 중상층, militarism, 군사주의, militarized prostitution, 군사화된 매춘, military budget, 군수 예산, military installation, 군사시설, military spending, 군수 소비, military superpower, 군사 강대국, military industrial complex, 군산 복합체, militia, 무장 단체, minority, 소외된 사람, miscarriages, 유산, misogyny, 여성 혐오증, missile defense program, missile 방어 체제, multinational forces, 다국적 부대, multiracial, 다중문화 과정, mutual responsibility, 서로의 책임. And letter Z, actually we have nothing in letter Z, so I'll just read a few words from W. Working class, 노동계급, World Bank, 세계은행, World Food Program, 세계 식량 계획, World Power, 세계적 강대국, World Situation, 세계 상황, World Trade Center, 세계무역센터. So that my experience in the network really shaped my thoughts about translation. So I'm going to read just 2 paragraphs from this pamphlet published by Ugly Duckling Press. The US established the temporary military rule of Korea from 1945 to 1948 and never left. South Korean activists say there are nearly 100 US military bases and installations in South Korea, a land only 1/4 the size of California. In a few years, the bases will be consolidated into 2 massive bases, one of which would become the largest overseas US military base. And that's called Camp Humphreys. Currently, there are approximately 28,000 US troops stationed in South Korea. In time of war, the US military has operational control over South Korean forces. Since we are still technically at war, we are also technically and perpetually under US military command. I come from such neo-colony. Since the end of the Korean War, the US and South Korea have carried out joint military exercises. The names of these joint exercises are worthy of our attention as translators. Counter blow, strong shield, focus, lens, team spirit, RSO and I. Key resolve, foal, eagle. These are neo-colonial joints, hybrids, spirits. These are order words, to use Deleuze and Guattari's term. I traverse such order words and map them and superimpose another kind of map, the map of my dislocation, including my translations of Kim Il-sun's poetry. For me, Benjamin's translation is a mode, must be jointed with translation is an anti-neo-colonial mode. I must speak as a twin. So I was very inspired by the image behind Jen Scapatone. And then Jen also asked me to talk about my translation practice in my own writing. So I'll just talk about how translation happened in my book, DMZ Colony. In DMZ Colony, I explore the geopolitical and ideological division of Korea. Excavating history from historical amnesia is an act of translation. Excavation of memory requires translation because buried, erased, or subjugated memory is rarely and hardly translated for you. The placeless perspective of exile is not readily narrated for you either. Therefore, the only way I can translate the overlapping histories of Korea and the US is to narrate and translate them myself. I have a name for such translation technique. I call it auto-translation. Auto-translation was the primary poetic device for my book. It is what allowed me to translate and resist the borders of neocolonialism and imperialism. It instructed me to translate only the language of vowels, birds, and vertigo. It instructed me to trace, transfer, transmit, transliterate, and transpose. It made me fall into a trance. DMZ Colony is a work of trans-narration. Auto-translation can confront napalm, Tarzan, bomb, Agent Orange, Daisy Cutter, and drones. Auto-translation transmits signs and styles of dots, circles, and dandruff. Auto-translation thrives in the simultaneity of the personal and collective. Auto-translation is forever political and planetary. Auto-translation speaks orphaned words. Auto-translation is eternally motherless. The Korean Demilitarized Zone is approximately 160 miles long and 2.5 miles wide. The DMZ runs across the 38th parallel, a division created after World War II with the end of the 35-year-long Japanese occupation of Korea. The US occupied the South and the Soviet Union, the North. The US still occupies South Korea with military installations, bases, and troops. The Korean border is one of the most militarized borders in the world. On February 23, 2018, the day of my poetry reading with Daniel Bezutsky at the Pulitzer Arts Foundation, I walked across Forest Park in St. Louis, Missouri. I was heading toward the St. Louis Art Museum. I heard a kind of muted, distant calling, a polyphony of cries, because I had never heard the flock calls of snow geese before. I was baffled by the flood of sound, seemingly from nowhere and everywhere. Instinctively, I turned my head from side to side, then up. My head tilted back triggered vertigo, a common symptom of Meniere's disease. My ears flapped about dizzyingly like a sparrow and followed the migrating snow geese above. The geese promptly instructed me a chorus. Return, 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 return. Then they flew even higher out of my ear's reach. The snow geese must have felt sorry for the homesick sparrow from a faraway place, for they dropped me a little line from the sky. See you at DMZ. Alone again, I could only chirp to myself. Translator for hire. Hire me. An Hak-seop. Mr. An was a political prisoner from 1953 to 1995. He currently lives in a farming village within the civilian control zone on the South Korean side of the DMZ. To enter the DMZ village near the city of Gimpo, west of Seoul, I had to pass a guard post manned by young soldiers. I also observed seemingly endless barbed wire fencing across the rice fields. An, now in his 80s, remains a North Korean sympathizer. Every time a missile is test fired in North Korea, usually before or after the massive biannual joint US and ROK military exercises, An is placed under house arrest. I recorded An and also scribbled in my notebook while listening to his life story at his house on December 23, 2016. I remain a daughter of neo-colony. Torture, indiscriminate beatings. For instance, if you dropped your chopsticks or rice ball, what's that signal? What's that code? They beat the shit out of us. They demanded meaning, yet meaningless. It was impossibly absurd. For instance, if you accidentally dropped your wooden pillow at night, you signaled. This comrade of mine was too frail. I said I was the one. These guys still use the Japanese word for shotgun. My arms were not long enough for a loop, for a shotgun to be tied, so they did it this way. For instance, a neo-colonial code. For instance, an anti-neo-colonial code. For instance, impossibly a loop, impossibly a ribbon, impossibly neo-colonial. For instance, indiscriminate signs, meaning, Mr. An. For instance, a few drops of urine, impossibly coded. On July 2nd, 2018, my flight took me to Marfa, Texas, not my usual migratory route. Nevertheless, during my brief stay, I was able to meet swallows and sparrows, and I observed other exceptional migratory wings from Mexico. Some small winged children were captured and separated from their parents and placed in concentration camps along the border of Texas, US, and Mexico. Who will translate their wings? Whenever my ears would let me, I looked up at the night skies in order to track Planet 9. Being the compulsive translator that I am, I traced and traced the planet's orbitary routes, its rotations of capture, torture, and massacre. The universe is such a dizzying place that my ears were spinning out of control. Planet 9, come in, Planet 9. The language of capture, torture, and massacre is difficult to decipher. It is practically a foreign language. What a nightmare. But as a foreigner myself, I'm able to detect the slightest flicker of palpitations and pain. Difficult syntax. It may show up as faint dots and lines, but they're often blood, snow, and even dandruff. How do I know? Foreigners know. An Kim narrated as she continued to circle and circle Planet 9 with her pen. Her circles were extraordinary. I decided to translate the stories of 8 girls who survived the Samcheong Hamyang massacre, which took place in Gyeongsangnam-do, a southern province of South Korea in 1951. My decision to translate the girls' stories wasn't entirely mine alone. It can take billions of years for light to reach us through the galaxies, which is to say, history is ever arriving. So it's most likely that the decision, seemingly all mine, was already made years ago by someone else, which is to say, language, that is to say, translation, always arises from collective consciousness. I will name the surviving orphans one by one in honor of the nameless children who are still homesick, captive, in detention, in internment, in concentration camps, in seas, in deserts, on Planet 9, and such. Orphan, 우기묘. 달이 절면서 식구 찾으러 논밭으로 나갔다. 어머니는 죽어 있고 엎여 있던 동생은 살아 있었다. 띠를 풀어서 동생을 업었다. 동생이 울고 있었는지 아닌지 기억이 안 난다. 따발총 소리에 귀가 멍해졌다. 군인들이 다시 돌아오고 있었다. 죽은 척했다. 어머니 배 위에 누웠다. 어머니 입이 벌려져 있었는데 점심때 국수 말아먹은 냄새가 났다. 국수 한 가락이 어머니 목에 붙어 있다. 신음하는 소리가 나더니 누가 나 죽여라 했다. 군인들이 다시 총을 쏘았다. 논두렁이에서 나오니 마을 사람들이 네 동생 다리 봐라 했다. 돌아보니 다리가 다 날아가고 없었다. 똥 묻은 바지만 몸뚱이에 달려 있었다. 반쯤 타버린 집에 들어가니 마을 사람들이 쉬고 있었다. 마을 사람들이 네 등에 살점 덩어리 붙어 있다 했다. 귀머거리 척했다. 끝. 고아 우기묘. Orphan, Kim Sung-rae. I saw countless charred bodies. I saw rows and rows of corpses. A year later, on a rainy summer day, I heard cries from the pit. Oblong, oblong. I saw ghosts floating about in the forest. They circled and circled me. I think just to save time, I'm just going to read. I'll skip a few things. In the neo-colony, eliminate, eradicate, obliterate the national security law apparatus. Will it change your political view or not? Old Your Excellency. Will it change your political view or not? New Your Excellency. Where e Mr. An. In the penal colony. Question number 10. Have you ever been a member of or in any way associated with the Communist Party? Old INS apparatus. Question number 10. Have you ever been a member of or in any way associated, either directly or indirectly, with A, the Communist Party, B, any other totalitarian party, C, a terrorist organization? New US CIS apparatus. A, eternity, B, eternity, C, eternity. In the DMZ colony. I'll leave it up to your imagination. A, E, B, E, C, E. Mirror words come out of my thoughts about translation. Translation is a mode, equals translation is an anti-neocolonial mode. I obsess about order words that are given in our society. In 1945, it took less than 30 minutes for order words to be carried out to divide the country I was born in along the 38th parallel north. Order words compel division, war, and obedience around the world, but other words are possible. Translation as an anti-neocolonial mode can create other words. I call mine mirror words. Mirror words are meant to compel disobedience, resistance. Mirror words defy neocolonial borders, blockades. Mirror words flutter along borders and are often in flight across oceans, even galaxies. Mirror words are homesick. Mirror words are halo. Mirror words are orphaned words. Now look at your words in the mirror. Translate, translate. Did you? Do it again. Do it. Kak ha ke nyang im ni ka. Sky similes for snow geese. Kiok. Ah. Return, blackface spoonbill, return. Kiok. Heard. Ah. Return, red-crowned crane, return. Kiok. Yea. Return, white-naped crane, return. Eared. Aw. Sparrow, what took you so long? Meared. Reared. Yaw. During the Korean War, cranes had no place to land. Eared. Eared. E. North, south, north. Peered. Neared. E. Dead, dead, dead. Geared. Ah. Sky, sky, sky. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Donmi. Uh, wow, there's so much to process and to ruminate over. I think that we will all be mulling over this presentation for some time. Thank you so much for that. That was extraordinary. I am full of questions and thoughts and comments for you and for Jen. I know that many people in the audience have questions and remarks as well, and I can see the comments rolling in and all the excited, enthusiastic praise and gratitude. So I want to convey that to you. I will get the conversation started with some questions, but please feel free for those of you in the audience to raise your hand electronically or to put a question into the chat, and we'll try to field them both. We have about 15 minutes for questions now. I'm just really struck about by the overlap between both of your work and thinking about translation as a kind of activism, first of all, and how creative works of translation can repudiate regimes of power. And the engagement with oral testimony in both of your pieces that you performed today, and in your printed work. Also, the thinking about bodies as always involved in art making, the somatic aspects, and taking on translation as a form of authorship and a form of creative making. And Donmi, I'm really struck by how you're fashioning a kind of dictionary of translation, fashioning a glossary of redefining the act of translation through the term auto translation and through this idea of mirror words, which I believe you defined as tracing, transferring, sorry, auto translation is defined as tracing, transferring, transmitting, transliterating, and transposing, and always political and always planetary. And then this idea of mirror words as compelling disobedience, I think you said, and as a kind of resistant mode. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that, about your translation practice and how it has, you've just said a lot about it, but I'm going to ask you to say more because I'm curious to hear your thoughts and to talk about the translation practice in a different form. I know that you've written elsewhere, I think it was in the manifesto that you mentioned earlier, published by UDP, where you talk about translation as a way to remind us of the hell that is both within and outside of the US empire, and that it's not necessarily a joyfully cross-cultural encounter, but rather a very specific anti-neocolonial activity or action. So could you speak a bit about that and about the translation, what you've chosen to translate, how and why, and how this idea of auto translation maybe applies both to your own creative work in Hardly War and DMZ Colony, but also in your translations of Kim Hai-soon and other Korean writers?
So maybe I should just say how I came to translation. When I began, I just wanted to know, I was absent. I grew up in South Korea as a child, then we left. So I was absent during maybe about the 2 decades of the dictatorship. So we were gone most of the 70s and the 80s. So I really wanted to know how women survived during that time. And I also wanted to know what women were writing. Because when I was growing up, I grew up mostly with women, or, families and extended families, because my father was gone most of the time and he doesn't really have a family. So I really only time I saw men were like outside the house. So I was really interested in sort of going back, but I didn't want to just go back as a visitor or tourist. I really wanted to understand, first of all, how I wanted to understand my dislocation, why we left, and what it meant, and what it meant for me to grow up seeing my father's photographs of war, not just of Korea, but all around Asia and also even in the Middle East. So I just wanted to, so that's how I came to translation. And then when I was translating, I wanted to, it wasn't so much, I was learning about, of course, the way the feminist Korean poets, feminist poets were innovating their language and how they were writing against the grain, how they were breaking out of that sort of more conventional language that has been defined for them by men. So that was another kind of inspiration to reflect on how I want to use my language too, which now is English, even though it may not sound like English, but I do speak English and live with it and write in it now. So, okay, so now I lost my train of thought. So maybe Jen Hoffer can answer too.
Yes. Yes, and I appreciate your comment, Jen. And English is always English is. Maybe you could address the same question. In the piece, the new piece that you read, that you co-wrote with JD, you ask about what is right action, and when is translation activism not political? When are we not thinking about the violence at the border? I think you said. If you could maybe answer the same question about how you came to involve politics with your translation, that would be wonderful.
I'm gonna attempt to exercise a skill I don't have and be brief, because I see that a person named Brandon has had his hand up since the questions began. There's never a moment I wish translation is not political. I mean, ever. And all language is political. One of the things that JD and I wrote, I started translating way before JD and I started working together, but we write in our manifesto for ultra translation, which is available for free on our website if anybody wants to. I'll throw the link in the chat later, but I didn't read from it because it's like widely available. And also because Jen Scapitone very gracefully quoted from it. Thank you very much for that intro. Who we translate as political, how we translate as political. Every time we use language, it's political. There isn't, Donmi said a few moments ago, one moment. There was something about billions of years. The stars are shine their light on us from billions of years ago in the galaxy. I'm totally misquoting you, Donmi. And then you said history is ever arriving. I have the book, so I'm going to go look it up later, but sorry to misquote you in front of you. But just thinking about the ways that all the language we use carries all that history and all that charge, which is possibility, but it is also colonization, and it is also neo-colonization, and it is also our responsibility toward right action. So it's like, I don't even know how to think outside that question. Lately I've been saying that I grew up monolingual in a bilingual, bicultural family, and that's political. And the reasons that families choose or don't choose to share our languages, our historical and ancestral languages, with our young people are completely political, and who has access to which kinds of resources to develop and be valorized is political, and how we do or don't think of bi or multilingualism as a resource versus as a deficit it's all completely political. So I think to move toward that kind of practice as a creative person, in the ways that not just Donmi and JD and I, but many, many, many people who are here in the Zoom, I'm seeing. So I just want to return so much chat love that I'm seeing so many names of people whose work makes me able to do the work I do. So thank you really very much for being here. Y'all know who you are. It's like 99% of the people in this audience. But that decision to foreground the politics of language in that way, and also the decision to devote your creative life to being creative explicitly in relationship to other people's work. So it's like every act that undermines the idea of the heroic singular, like I was just a bolt of lightning from the muse came down and struck me and now I'm a genius, or whatever it is it's supposed to be. Anything and everything we do to undermine that is making the world as we need it to be. And so, of course, it's political because our survival relies upon it.
Thank you.
Okay, from now on, Jen Hoffa can answer all the questions.
I think we have a question from Brandon, whose hand has been up. Brandon.
Sorry, I feel self-conscious now, especially because I'm going to ask Jen a question. But Jen, you kind of briefly touched on this, the difference between interpretation and translation. And I feel like those are words that get used interchangeably sometimes. So I was curious to hear you speak more about what you take to be the differences between those modes.
I'm so laughing right now because one of my most beloved primary collaborators as an interpreter and language justice practitioner is laughing at me from the other Zoom box right now. And because I explain this to people multiple times a day. Interpreting and translating, we do use the terms interchangeably. If you are a person who does that, I am not intending to make you feel bad in any way, shape, or form. That is how our culture references these activities. And both, so Danmi, actually, I really love that you started writing about, that you started presenting about interpretation as kind of the political grounding, because it is so deeply connected to what allows people to literally communicate with one another. So often people share, they share a challenge or they share an oppression, but they don't share the language to talk about it. And so both interpreting and translation make it possible for those conversations to happen. So I just wanted to name back to that, how important it is to hear you say that. Interpreting is the live, spoken, or signed transfer of information from one language to another. Translation is the written, textual transfer of information from one language to another. Why does the distinction matter, other than that I am a school marm at heart? Because they require completely different skill sets. So translation is much slower. If I'm interpreting live, I do simultaneous interpreting. If I'm interpreting live and I'm hold on, I need to consult 800 dictionaries right now. I'll get back to you in 4 hours. Your conversation has just totally gone down the drain, right? But when I'm translating, I can consult my dictionaries, I can consult my friends, I can, Google the heck out of a term, whatever, et cetera, et cetera. When I'm interpreting, it's you've got 2 seconds to think of, whatever you're gonna say. So some people do both. I do both. My collaborator, Alexia, does both. JD does both. Lots of people do both. Lots of people only do one of those 2 things. So yeah, it's really, really important. And also just to name, thank you, Susan, for saying that you are an amazing translator. You may not be an amazing interpreter. Many people assume that if you are bilingual or multilingual, you can just automatically start interpreting until you try it for 5 seconds. And then you realize that it's actually a skill. Thank you for asking that and giving me the opportunity to explain that.
Thank you. And Susan Bernotsky, thank you for being here. We'd love to hear your question and comment. Hello.
Thank you for this amazing event. It is so wonderful to see your faces and to hear your voices and to hear your beautiful translation stories. I am so happy right now. I guess I'm gonna make, I have a question that could be for either speaker, but I'm gonna say it's a question for Danmi just because Jen had a last question. So, and I'm really listening to both your talks. I got really interested in the relationship between process and form, because Jen, you spoke very explicitly about really it being a collaborative process and the point of translation being this exchange and process. And Danmi, the way you were speaking, process is implied at every moment, whether it's the birds becoming the children with wings becoming the work. And your work then, when it lands on the page, is so formally, intricate. And so I know you're thinking about, where you're landing, where the work is landing. But I feel that the process is very much a part of it. So I'd just love to hear more, either from either of you, really, but about the relation, the traces of the process in what we read when we take the pamphlet and read it, to take the book.
Well, my process is kind of all over the place. I I don't have a chance to write all the time. And my excuse is that because I'm translating Kim Il-sung's poetry. So I translate more than I actually write my own poems. But the first piece that I read, from Sky Translation, about the birds, the snow geese above St. Louis, I just spontaneously took photos with my iPhone. And then about, I don't know, maybe another 2 months passed. And then I finally downloaded it and I printed it out. And then just by accident, I just thought, well, I'll just look up St. Louis Googled it. And then the latitude was exactly the same as the DMZ of Korea. So when I found that out, I immediately knew how to translate those birds. So that's how that came about. And literally I put a tracing paper over the photos of the sky that I took. And then I knew how to translate those birds as letters D and Z. And I knew what they were telling me. So that's kind of the sort of intuitive and spontaneous process. And then let's see. And I really didn't know. I knew that I wanted to write about, after Hardly War, in which I explored the Korean War through my father's photographs and his memory. So the next book, I wanted to write about what took place during the dictatorship. So I thought that's what was going to happen. So when I had a chance to go back to Seoul in 2016, I just happened to meet, I reconnected with an old friend. And then when I told her that I want to, write my next book about what took place especially in Gwangju in 1980, there was a massacre of civilians. Then she said, oh, then you must meet this person who was a political prisoner. So that was another kind of, strange coincidence. And once again, I took, like I said, I scribbled and I just had to jot things down while I was listening to him because it was so intense. And then I thought that when I came back, and it was at least about a year that I was able to listen to it again, then I thought, well, since I took notes and drew things while I was listening to him, then I thought maybe I was able to, that has that transmission of the sense of trauma that that I was experiencing while I was listening to him. So that's how that came about, using my scribbled, my horrible handwriting. And then when I met with the researcher, the investigator, Dr. An Kim Jung-ae, she investigated all some of the human rights violations of the South Korean military, as well as some of the massacres that took place before and during the Korean War. This is anti-communist genocide that took place. So I thought she was going to tell me about what took place during the dictatorship. Then she started telling me about the stories of the survivors and this particular massacre that she investigated. So once again, I couldn't make myself listen to the recording for another 2 years or so. And when I decided to, and I really didn't know what to do with that information, it was just too overwhelming. So then I was reading Glissant at that time, and I have a quote here. He said, "No imagination helps avert the destitution in reality. None can oppose oppressions or sustain those who withstand in body or spirit. But imagination change mentalities, however slowly it may go about this. So that kind of gave me the permission to use imagination, and for me, that imagination was pretending as if I was one of the orphans, the surviving girls. I mean, who are now in the 80s and 90s, and so a few of them have already passed away. So that's how that kind of translation came about. And then just, I don't know, I just work intuitively most of the time. I only just wrote that thing about the translation today just because I had to. But I want to add just very quickly to that question of the difference between translation and interpretation. I just want to emphasize that for both, it's really not about just the language or words. It's really, we're talking about lives, people's lives. And so therefore, when we are translating, our language is always classed and gendered, nationed, is raised. So there's always power associated with language. And therefore, you know, once again, language is political. Thank you. That's it. Thank you, Susan. Good to see you.
I think everyone's asking, can we go for another 5 hours? I think we all want to. There's so much to say, and everyone's happy to be in this virtual space together. Can I keep you with me here? So we have a few questions in the queue. I see Jihei Kim, Jen Scapitoni, and also Don Harmon, who had your hand up earlier. Jihei, do you want to start us off?
Thank you. Thank you for this wonderful workshop or webinar. I also have a question for Dong-Mi Choi, because I was also fascinated by the book DMZ Colony. And in the book, you also use a lot of images and photographs too. And and you also mentioned your father was a photojournalist in South Korea as well. So like in terms of like translation and interpretation, how those images speak out or speak for you or speak to us, speak to the audience too. Thank you.
I'll just be quick about this because there may be other questions for Jen Hoffer. So I used my father's photographs the most at the very end, at the end of the book. And that was, I wanted to, somehow I just had this in my mind that I wanted that last section to look like a film. I wanted it to be like a film. So when I saw the film, the experimental documentary by Oshima, filmmaker Oshima, Nagisa Oshima, and he went to Seoul in 1960, and he took black and white photographs. And he also took photographs of the student revolution, which was an uprising. It was against the Syngman Rhee. He was a U.S. appointed president, first president of South Korea, Republic of Korea. So I really loved the idea. And my father was also there. My father filmed that, the student revolution. So I love the idea of Oshima and my father kind of maybe in the same place even. So his documentary was just all made of black and white still photographs with his own narration above, throughout. So that was basically the inspiration for that, the use of the photographs. And because I couldn't do a film, the kind of montage that Oshima did, I just wanted to create kind of my own montage by cutting up, using different photos, juxtaposing different photos.
Super. I think Don Harmon, you had a question for Jen.
Thanks. I kind of want to stay on the track of translation versus interpretation and sort of, I guess, ask a quick follow-up to one of the previous questions. I'm sort of interested in the difference in title between interpretation as instigation and a manifesto for ultra translation. And especially that in this talk and in your work, you've referred to the piece of performative interpretation as an ultra translation. And I guess my question, my curiosity is there a lurking potentiality for a practice of ultra interpretation, kind of within between the lines of those texts? I'm not sure if, given the sort of live practice of interpretation, if that's an absurd thought, but I'm just curious about where, if that potentiality is there and what that kind of practice might look like.
I'm gonna think about that. It's a delight to get asked a question that I've literally never thought about before. Oh, Alexia says yes. Okay, great. The answer is yes. Next, no. The ethics of interpreting it's not that translation doesn't have ethics or experimentalism doesn't have ethics, but when you're doing live interpreting in any context, but the primary contexts that I work in and with, in collaboration with Alexia and many, many other amazing language justice practitioners, and I can talk a little bit about what language justice is if anybody is curious to hear about it. I work primarily in a combination of community-based social justice and legal interpreting contexts, where how I interpret, and I don't mean interpret in the literary critical sense, like, oh, did you read DMZ Colony? How did you interpret the use of the images in that book? Which we could have a really generative conversation. We just heard from Don Mi about how she feels about the use of images in her work and in Hardly War. And we could also have a different interpretation, and that's great. And I'm guessing that Don Mi would celebrate that I might have read something different in those images, and we could have a really generative, wonderful conversation about that. When you're interpreting, there's often more than one word choice, but it is really, truly not my job to be imaginative or experimental. It is my job to support the autonomous and full communication between the two or more parties in a conversation. And it is literally at times a life and death matter what words I choose to use. So I am definitely not thinking about, so I'm going to give you a quick example just in case some people didn't read this. Oh my gosh, linguistic mediation is actually like a whole term in interpreting. I'm also an interpreter trainer. If anybody would like a 3-hour interpreter training right now, I'm happy to do that. I'm just like, yeah, linguistic mediation is actually a technical term, which is how interpreters step outside our role to ask a question if we don't understand a word. Why is that important? Because an entire court case or an entire person's housing or person's imprisonment or non-imprisonment can hang on a word. So I'm going to read you something really quickly so that I can contextualize what I'm about to say. So I'm just reading one tiny paragraph from the Ultra Translation Manifesto. Untranslatability is at the root of our practice. Moments of untranslatability lead directly to untranslation, undertranslation, overtranslation, an excess, extra translation, a lack, a limit, an excrescence, an impropriety, distranslation, retranslation, multi-translation, a mistake, a conflict, distranslation with a Y, an understanding of the potential in not understanding. an ultra translation. So, and we then talk about how ultra translation is like a hum or breath. It's like the ide of antenna ide. It's not like I'm like, oh, I'm going to sit down and write an ultra translation right now. It's these moments, right, that glimmer in the work that we make. And it's not that when we're interpreting, we don't have those moments, but the creativity in the work of interpreting is 100% located in me not speaking as me. The creativity is in how supple can I be in removing myself, my opinion, my super bossy, everything about me. Anybody here who knows me knows what I'm like. And to just step back from that, also to step back from all of the privilege and all of the right to speak that whiteness wants to give to me, and make my role in a space be about the autonomous, full, and accurate communication between other people. And I actually don't know if that's pretty ultra. And I don't know if there's an ultra beyond that that has to do with experimentalism, which is why we frame our interpreted improvised poem making as not, I mean, we're using the tools of interpreting, like literally you can go on our Vimeo and you can see some examples of us doing it. We stick some paper. I mean, normally you don't ever show anybody your note taking when you're interpreting, like, oh my gosh, so embarrassing. But you know, art is about vulnerability. We stick paper up on the wall. You can see us taking notes. You see us going back and forth, but we're purposely making it impossible for one another because it's not about accuracy of interpreting. It's about accuracy of something else. It's about accuracy of breaking open, or I mean, if you even want to call that accuracy, it's about accuracy of being willing to be in error in a creative space. And that's also pretty ultra. They just function really, really differently. I think they're in conversation with one another really differently. But there's something about holding someone's, so I'm thinking about the Glissant quote about the imagination that Don Mee just read. And I also see people have their hands up, so I will come to a close momentarily. But Don, you did this to me. You made me think about all this stuff. When we're translating, we are holding people's stories, people's narratives. We're holding the life of their imagination that we can access differently when we can access the source that they are writing from. To some extent, we can access some of it. You can't ever access the whole source. Like there is no source, right? But there's something about actually holding the impact of someone's like daily life in your language that is very sobering and very grounding in a different way. Like I don't, there's no rankings, like they exist, you know, it's all horizontal, but there is something about that that makes me feel like the paragraph that I read from Ultra Translation, like I'm not reading a paragraph like that about interpreting, maybe. I don't know, that's just maybe a start.
Thank you. I know that we're reaching the end of our time. Jen Scapitoni, I think you have a question that you wanted to.
I think I'll translate it into, oh, I didn't use that term on purpose, but into just like a little comment that maybe could prompt people to read. And then, I don't know, maybe we have time for Yael's question, but I kind of wanted to just make a comment about how much all three of your practices, or all two, depending on how you count it all, with JD being in the room here, are really redefining authorship as also, or selfhood, that a fundamental part of being an author or being a self is listening. And, you know, one of the things that a student of mine in writing and social change said when I launched this conversation, I won't get into it, but the student said, school is teaching us how to be articulate, but it's not teaching us how to be good listeners. And I thought that was one of the most mind-blowing things that I've heard in a classroom, and so important. And what we have here in your practices is this, this skill of listening and leaving traces of the listening that are flawed, that are fallible, but also lead the way into new conversations and new articulations that you could never have had before. And I put that quote from interpretation as instigation into the chat. When we interpret, we are speaking as someone else, saying someone else's words, and at the same time, we are being ourselves entirely, insofar as we ourselves who seek a practice grounded in listening and being the conduit for conversations that otherwise might not take place. I just want to give so much love to that quote.
I'm just going to jump in super quickly and say one word, which is a word I've been thinking about a lot. And I think this is what links writing, translating, and interpreting. And that word is channeling.
Yael, I see that you have a question. So glad that you are here. I know this conversation is of great interest to you. So over to you.
It really is. I hope you guys can hear me. These are new headphones. Yes, okay. So I guess I have a follow-up question to what Don asked, and kind of it has to do with listening that Jen brought up. And it's mainly to Jen and to Antenna and to the project itself. So Rachel introduced me to Antenna, Rachel Galvin, I think in 2016, and I've been following you guys ever since. And it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, or did you kind of, and it sounds like you got into this with, I don't know if a specific one, but like you had like a general direction in mind, and you had an energy that was going somewhere, and then it kind of shifted and it changed. And I guess when you're asking, and when you started out, it sounded like you wanted to make an intervention within your interpretation. Actually, you had these ideas about all the people in the room sitting with headphones, right? And everyone has headphones, not just the people who are speaking the minor language, and there's simultaneous translation and interpretation that everyone can hear. And it sounds like you kind of move towards focusing more of an interpersonal interaction, and that the experimentation and exercises that you're into now are more about what happens between two people. And maybe if you, I don't know if that's true at all, but if it is, or if it's not, if you can say something about how you feel about, no, you're not good, about maybe, I don't know, what shift happened, or did it happen, and kind of like how you reached, I don't know, the temporary ending of this project.
Try to be brief. I will be brief. So yeah, I don't understand our projects that way. But and maybe part of the reason you do is that, so originally when JD and I started working together, they were in graduate school, they were living in Tijuana and doing their MFA at UC San Diego, which is quite close to Los Angeles. So we were actually able to do on the ground language justice work together. We bought a set of equipment together, which neither of us uses anymore because it was so beautiful and made by anarchists, and anarchists aren't great with customer service, surprise. So, but it's really, really amazing, like tiny little private radio stations as our interpreting equipment. And we were doing some interpreting together, and we were sort of joining our creative practice and our language justice practice. And we, as soon as JD moved back to Houston, which is actually not that close to Los Angeles, we realized, I mean, we didn't realize, we knew that language justice work is community-based, it's on the ground. Nobody is going to be like flying somebody in from Houston to a community meeting in Los Angeles so they can interpret, like, who has the money for that? You don't even, whatever. So we realized that we needed to work on developing our relationships with other language justice practitioners in our local cities. And we continue to think language justice together and write about it together. How to Build Language Justice is really just lays out the framework of language justice. It's not, I mean, it's creative and beautifully written and blah, blah, but it's not like a poetry text. It's literally about, its intention is to educate ourselves about what we thought about language justice and to share with others. So we each were working with collectives of people based in our respective cities in Houston and Los Angeles, and realized that our work together was about using our cross-language practice and the learnings and questionings that come from that as a generative strategy. So we still, for the entire time that Antenna Aire was working together, we were doing multilingual programming, sometimes with live interpreting, sometimes not. We don't always have to understand everything denotatively. Language functions in all kinds of somatic ways. But so I would say more that we realized that what our work what we wanted to do together was less of that on the ground, or it just wasn't logistically realistic for us to do that on the ground work. But it all, I mean, we're all whole people, and I feel like I was really appreciating listening to Don Mee talk about your experience of writing while listening and sort of imbuing the marks that you were making, which we then saw projected and which are in, like we see traces of those in the work, that's imbued with the stories you're hearing. And that maybe is the ultra interpreting, right? So like the notes that I take while I'm interpreting, maybe someday I'm going to make something out of those marks on the page, and that's the ultra interpretation. And maybe that's a form of ultra interpreting that Don Mee was doing as she's mediating like this very intense, overwhelming information that she's getting, and like literally letting it mark through her pen on the page, and then transforming that, channeling that into something else.
Thank you. Oh, thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone, for being here and for bringing your energy and your presence. Thank you to Jen and Don Mee and Han, and to all the questioners and all the translators and thinkers and imaginers who are here. This has just been extraordinary, and I would like to keep the warmth of our conversation to remain within this space longer. But I think our time has elapsed. So thank you again for convening this, and thank you especially to Eliana, to JD in absentia, in presentia, and to Don Mee for your extraordinary presentations. I'm so glad that these are recorded so that they are accessible on YouTube. I think there was a mention earlier of this, but I just want to remind everyone that next Tuesday, I think, is that right, Jen Scapitoni? Next
February
Tuesday.
23rd.
Thank you, Han. We will have Jonathan Stalling and Sawako Nakayasu here to continue the conversation, the colloquium on exploratory translation. Is there anything else we need to say before we conclude? Have I said all of the things?
You have said it.
All
Just
right.
that this conversation, I put the YouTube link in the chat, but it lives at the website. The website also has links to suggested readings, just a handy place to gather all of that. Thank you all so much. And